My name is Natalie Carter, and at 32 years old, I never imagined that my own father would stand in front of an entire room of family, friends, and business leaders to declare me a failure. That was the moment everything I thought I knew about my family shattered. But before I tell you how I was publicly humiliated on my father's 60th birthday, and how my grandmother's shocking revelation changed the course of my life forever, I need to take you back to the beginning. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. If you love stories about family secrets, betrayal, and redemption, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. I'd love to know if you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family. I grew up in Newport, Rhode Island, in a world where appearances were everything. Ours was the kind of family whose home looked like something out of a glossy magazine: grand staircases, ocean views, manicured gardens, and whose last name carried weight at charity auctions and country clubs. My father, Edward Carter, had built his real estate empire from the ground up. By the time I was born, he was already a legend in Newport society. My mother, Victoria, came from old banking money and married him not just for love, but for ambition. Together, they were untouchable. My brother Daniel, 4 years older, was their crown jewel. He was perfect in their eyes. Yale undergrad, Harvard Business School, the natural heir to my father's empire. From the time we were children, he was groomed for success, while I was treated as the afterthought. I was the messy one, the dreamer, the child who doodled in the margins while he perfected his debate speeches. I never stood a chance at being the golden child. But my secret shame was that I tried. For years, I tried to fit into their world. I enrolled in business classes at NYU, studied finance and marketing, wore the pencil skirts and carried the briefcase, even though every day felt like dying a little inside. When I finally broke down and confessed to my mother that I couldn't do it anymore, her words cut deep. "Daniel never complained about his coursework. Why can't you be more like him?" That was the night I made the most terrifying decision of my life. I dropped out and enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design. The disappointment was palpable. My father didn't speak to me for months. When he finally did, it was only to say he'd cover my tuition but nothing else. "If you're going to throw away your potential," he told me, "you'd better learn to survive on your own." And so I did. I moved into a tiny studio in Brooklyn, scraping by with part-time jobs while trying to prove to myself, and maybe to them, that I was worthy. The only one who ever truly believed in me was my grandmother, Margaret. She wasn't like the rest of the Carters. She'd grown up in Ohio with modest roots, and even after marrying into wealth, she never forgot what it meant to value people over appearances. She would visit me in my cramped apartment, stand before my unfinished canvases, and say things like, "Your art speaks to something real, Natalie. Don't ever let them convince you otherwise." Looking back, I realize Margaret knew more than she let on. She carried secrets of her own, ones that would unravel everything we thought we knew about our family. But at the time, I was too consumed by my own battle for recognition to notice the glint in her eye when she said, "Trust me, Natalie. You're exactly where you need to be." And I had no idea that her words would come back to me the night of my father's birthday party, the night everything changed forever. When I think about my childhood, what stands out the most isn't the luxury or the privilege, it's the silence. Not literal silence. The Carter estate was never quiet, with its constant flow of guests, staff, and the echo of footsteps down marbled hallways. No, it was a different kind of silence, the kind where your voice is heard but never really listened to, where your presence is tolerated but rarely acknowledged. I spent most of my life being overshadowed by my brother Daniel. Even when we were children, he had this aura about him, as though the world had been created to applaud his every move. At school, teachers adored him. On the tennis court, he was unstoppable. At family dinners, my father would raise his glass and declare, "Daniel, that's exactly what a Carter should be." And me? I was there, sketching in the margins of my notebooks, drawing faces no one recognized, painting colors that no one bothered to ask about. There was one night I can never forget. I was 14, and I had just won a regional art competition. My painting a watercolor of a crumbling lighthouse against a stormy sea had been displayed in a small gallery downtown. It was the first time I felt like maybe, just maybe, I had something of my own to offer the world. My parents attended the ceremony, standing stiffly in the corner, clapping politely when my name was called. For a brief moment, I thought they were proud of me. But on the drive home, they didn't mention my award once. Instead, they spent the entire ride talking about Daniel's upcoming debate tournament at Yale. By the time we reached the estate, my painting was lying flat in the trunk, forgotten. That night, I sat awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, a knot in my stomach I couldn't untangle. That was the pattern. Whenever I accomplished something, it was quietly brushed aside. Daniel's victories, however, were celebrated like national holidays. When he made the varsity tennis team, my father threw a dinner party in his honor. When I had my first small exhibit at a local art fair, my mother barely glanced at the pieces before suggesting I use my free time more wisely. Their dismissal wasn't cruel. Exactly, it was worse. It was indifference. Still, I tried to earn their approval. I buried myself in business classes at NYU, forcing myself to memorize profit margins and market projections, hoping that if I proved I could live in their world, they might finally accept me. But the harder I tried, the emptier I felt. I'll never forget one night during finals week, when I called my mother sobbing, saying I couldn't do it anymore. Her voice was cold, clipped. Daniel never complained about his coursework. Why can't you be more like him? In that moment, something inside me snapped. I realized that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I tried to bend myself into the mold of the perfect Carter child, I would never be Daniel. Dropping out of NYU and transferring to the Rhode Island School of Design was both the most terrifying and liberating decision of my life. I remember standing outside the admissions office at RISD, clutching the acceptance letter with trembling hands. For once, I was doing something for myself. But when I told my parents, the look on my father's face was one of pure disgust. He didn't speak to me for months, and when he finally did, it was only to inform me that they would pay my tuition but nothing else. "If you're going to throw away your potential," he said, "you can at least learn to support yourself." That was how I ended up in Brooklyn after graduation, renting a tiny studio apartment with paint peeling from the walls and pipes that clanged in the middle of the night. I made just enough to cover rent by teaching art classes at a community center and picking up odd commissions. My parents never visited. Daniel came to New York often for business meetings, but he never once stopped by. I told myself I didn't care, but each time I saw his face in the society pages, smiling next to my father at some charity gala, the old ache returned. And yet, there were moments when I felt alive in a way I never had before. Standing in my cramped studio, paint on my hands, a half-finished canvas in front of me, I felt free. My art wasn't profitable, but it was mine. It was the only thing in my life that hadn't been compared to Daniel. The only place where I wasn't measured against someone else's expectations. The only person who ever truly understood that was my grandmother, Margaret. She was different from the rest of the family. She had grown up in Ohio, in a modest home, before marrying into wealth. Even after decades of living in Newport society, she had never lost her warmth or her perspective. She came to see me often in Brooklyn, ignoring the peeling paint and the cramped space. I can still picture her standing in front of one of my canvases, her silver hair perfectly styled, her eyes sharp with understanding. "Your art speaks to something real," she told me. "Edward and Victoria will never understand that not all value can be measured in dollars. But I see it. I see you." Those words kept me going on nights when I questioned everything. They were the only reminder that maybe I wasn't completely invisible. But what I didn't know then was that Margaret carried her own secrets. When she said she believed in me, there was more behind those words than I realized. She wasn't just speaking as a grandmother who wanted to comfort her granddaughter. She was speaking as someone who had lived a double life. Someone who had been quietly building something powerful while the rest of us assumed she was just a society matriarch. I didn't see it then, but the clues were there. The way she spoke about art with authority. the way she seemed to know names of collectors and galleries that I'd only heard whispered in my circles. The way she would say, "Trust yourself, Natalie. The world may not see your worth yet, but it will." At the time, I thought she was simply being kind. I had no idea she was foreshadowing a revelation that would shake the foundation of our family. As the date of my father's birthday drew closer, that old knot in my stomach returned. Every family gathering was an exercise in survival, but this one felt different. I couldn't shake the sense that something was about to happen, something I couldn't yet name. My father's 60th birthday wasn't just a milestone for him, it was a stage for a performance, and I already knew my role. I would be the daughter they smiled at politely, the one who gave a gift they didn't value, the one they subtly dismissed while Daniel shone under the spotlight. I had no idea that night would become the turning point of my entire life. And as I boarded the train to Newport with my carefully wrapped charcoal portrait in hand, I couldn't have imagined that by the end of that evening, every assumption I'd ever had about my family, about myself, and about my future, would be turned upside down. The invitation arrived on heavy ivory cardstock, embossed with the Carter family crest, as if I could ever forget where I came from. My mother's handwriting was nowhere on it. She never bothered with such details, but the message was clear. Attendance was not optional. "You are cordially invited to celebrate Edward Carter's 60th birthday," it read. Though in my family, cordially invited really meant expected. I sat in my Brooklyn studio holding the envelope, staring at the thick gold lettering until the words blurred. 60 years. My father had spent every one of them building an empire, brick by brick, deal by deal. This celebration wouldn't just be about his birthday. No. It would be a spectacle, another chance for him to remind the world of his triumphs. The Carters didn't throw parties, they staged coronations. A part of me wanted to toss the invitation in the trash, bury it under paint rags, and pretend it had never arrived. But I couldn't. Missing it would only widen the already gaping rift between us. And some pathetic piece of me still wanted to be seen, even if it meant walking into the lion's den. The days leading up to the party were restless. I found myself pacing my tiny apartment, paintbrush in hand, unable to focus on my canvases. Instead, I worked obsessively on a gift, something that might break through the wall my parents had built around their hearts. I dug out an old black and white photograph of my father standing in front of his first development project, his expression young, ambitious, and proud. I began sketching him in charcoal, capturing the lines of determination in his face, the confidence in his stance. It took me weeks to get it right. With each stroke, I poured into the portrait what I had never been able to say to him aloud. "I see you. I respect what you built. Please, see me too." The night before the party, my phone buzzed. Grandma Margaret, just hearing her name, lit a small fire of comfort in me. She never called unless she had something important to say. "I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow, dear," she said. Her voice was steady, warm, but there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. "I'll be there," I replied, though my chest tightened at the thought. "Are you excited?" There was a pause, just long enough to unsettle me. "Everything is as it should be," she said finally. Then, with a softness that almost made me cry, she added, "Remember, Natalie, you are exactly where you need to be in your journey." I clutched the phone to my ear, trying to decode her words. There was something deliberate about them, as though she were preparing me for something I couldn't yet imagine. "Is everything okay, Grandma?" I asked. "Perfectly fine," she said quickly. Too quickly. "We'll talk tomorrow." When we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my studio, staring at the nearly finished portrait. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, looping endlessly. "Exactly where you need to be." It sounded less like reassurance and more like a warning. The morning of the party, I woke with my stomach twisted in knots. I tried on 4 different dresses before settling on the simplest one I owned. Black, understated, impossible to criticize. My mother had once sneered at my style, calling it deliberately bohemian, so I chose something she couldn't use against me. I wrapped the portrait carefully in brown paper and tied it with twine. It wasn't a designer watch or a rare bottle of wine like the gifts my father's colleagues would bring, but it was all I could give. The train ride from New York to Rhode Island felt endless. I sat with the package in my lap, rehearsing conversations in my head, preparing myself for the inevitable questions. How's your hobby? When will you get a real job? Still scraping by in Brooklyn? Each imagined comment chipped away at my resolve. By the time we pulled into the station, my palms were damp and my heart thudded like a drum. A hired car drove me up the long, winding driveway to the estate. The Carter mansion loomed ahead, its Georgian columns pristine, the lawn manicured within an inch of its life. Even after all these years, the sight of it still filled me with a strange mix of awe and dread. This was the place where I had grown up, the place where I had first learned that I was never enough. As the car stopped in front of the house, I spotted valet attendants rushing to park expensive cars, staff carrying trays of crystal glasses, and caterers hauling crates of wine. It wasn't just a birthday party, it was a statement. Edward Carter was 60, and the world would know it. I took a deep breath, clutched the portrait, and stepped out. The autumn air was crisp, the kind that carried the smell of leaves and ocean salt. For a fleeting second, I wanted to turn and run back down the driveway, away from the gleaming windows and the ghosts of my past. But then the front door opened, and Teresa, the housekeeper who had been there since I was a child, smiled warmly at me. "Miss Natalie," she said, her voice thick with genuine affection. "It's so good to see you." She embraced me, and I clung to her longer than I should have, grateful for at least one person in that house who loved me without conditions. Inside, the mansion was buzzing with preparation. Staff moved like a well-oiled machine, arranging flowers, polishing silver, setting up in the grand dining room. From the great hall, I heard the faint strains of the string quartet rehearsing. Every detail was perfect, orchestrated with precision. I wandered into the solarium, where I found my mother giving instructions to the head caterer, her posture sharp and commanding. My father stood nearby, checking his watch, looking impatient. They didn't notice me until I cleared my throat. "Natalie," my mother said with a polite smile, kissing both my cheeks quickly, already distracted. "You made it! I was beginning to wonder." "The train was on time," I replied. My voice sounded too small in that cavernous room. I turned to my father. "Happy birthday, Dad." He gave me a one-armed hug, brief and perfunctory. "Thank you for coming," he said, his eyes already scanning the room. "Have you seen your brother?" Before I could answer, Daniel entered, tall, confident, every bit the Golden Heir. He carried a folder, which he handed directly to my father. "The quarterly reports," he said smoothly. "Revenue's up 15%. My father's face lit up, pride radiated off him like sunlight. "Excellent, son." Then Daniel turned to me with a practiced smile. "Hey, little sister. Still doing the starving artist thing?" My stomach clenched. I forced a smile. "Something like that." His wife, Sophia, stepped forward then, her expression soft, genuine. She hugged me warmly and whispered, "I love that dress on you." Unlike the rest of my family, she had always treated me with kindness. I often wondered how she managed to stay so gentle married to someone like Daniel. As my parents drifted away to greet arriving guests, I was left standing there, portrait in hand, feeling the familiar sensation of being invisible in my own family home. The house buzzed with activity, every corner filled with polished perfection, but beneath it all, I felt the pressure building, like the air before a storm. I didn't know what my father's big announcement would be that night, but I knew one thing with certainty: it wouldn't include me. And as I glanced across the hall, I caught sight of my grandmother Margaret stepping through the front door, fashionably late, her eyes sharp and knowing. She gave me the smallest nod, a silent signal that she had plans of her own. What I didn't realize then was that her arrival would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything I thought I knew about my family and about myself. From the moment Daniel walked into the room, I knew the evening was never meant to be about my father's birthday. It was about him, the Golden Heir. The way conversations paused when he appeared, the way eyes turned in his direction, It was as if the atmosphere itself shifted to make space for his presence. At 36, he had grown into the spitting image of my father. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. He carried himself like a man, stepping onto a stage he had rehearsed for his entire life, and in truth, he had. Daniel was raised to be admired, to be followed, to be celebrated. He slipped out of his tailored coat and handed it to the valet, with a smile that seemed effortless, though I knew from years of watching him that it was carefully practiced. My mother hurried toward him, eyes shining with pride, her voice rising with warmth that rarely touched me. My father's handshake with him lingered, the kind of grip between men who saw themselves in one another. And then there was Sophia, trailing just a step behind Daniel. Where his presence was commanding, hers was quietly disarming. She was elegance without effort, dressed in a gown that moved like water when she walked, but it wasn't her beauty that always struck me, it was her kindness. When she turned to greet me, her arms opened without hesitation, her embrace genuine, her smile uncalculated. In that brief hug, I felt more recognition than I had received from my parents all year. I stood at the edge of the room, clutching a glass of wine as guests began to arrive in waves. Politicians I recognized from the news, real estate developers who were rivals turned friends of my father, men with heavy watches and women dripping in diamonds. Their laughter carried easily, their conversations seamless, the language of wealth and success flowing around me as if I wasn't there at all. I moved from one small group to another, smiling politely, my mind racing. Everywhere I turned, I heard Daniel's name. Did you hear about the Boston project Daniel secured? Edward must be so proud. Daniel is a natural leader. He's expanded faster than anyone expected. Each word was another reminder of how far apart we lived, not just geographically, but in the eyes of our family and the world they valued. I tried to engage. A cousin asked me about my art, her tone sugar-sweet, but her eyes already darting elsewhere. "That's wonderful," she said, barely listening. "You must find it fulfilling." The pause before the last word told me everything she meant. Indulgent, frivolous, insignificant. I smiled and excused myself, retreating to the corner of the great hall where a string quartet was warming up. Their music floated into the air, elegant but haunting, as though it knew what was coming. It was then I overheard whispers about a big announcement. Two of my father's colleagues leaned close to each other, speaking in low voices but not low enough. "Edward's been planning this for months," one said. "It's going to be monumental. Quite the legacy move." The word sent a chill through me. Legacy. In my family, that word had weight. It wasn't about tradition or memories. It was about control, inheritance, power. And I knew instinctively that whatever was coming, Daniel was at the center of it. I wandered through the mansion, trying to steady myself. The rooms I had grown up in looked different now, filled with strangers and suffused with the glow of chandeliers. Every painting, every gilded frame, every antique piece of furniture seemed to belong to a world I had never truly been a part of. I thought of my father's eyes lighting up at Daniel's arrival, of my mother's unrestrained pride, and wondered if there had ever been a moment when they had looked at me that way. At one point, Sophia found me standing alone near the staircase. She slipped her arm through mine and said softly, "You look beautiful tonight." I almost laughed, the words feeling out of place. But the sincerity in her eyes stopped me. She meant it. "Try not to let all of this get to you," she whispered, tilting her head toward the dining room where more guests were gathering. "These events are like theater. It doesn't mean they define you." Her words were kind, but they didn't calm the unease building in me. Because if this was theater, I already knew the script, and I knew my role. As the evening moved toward dinner, the anticipation in the house thickened. Servants lit candles along the length of the massive mahogany table. Place cards dictated the social order, and I saw mine placed far from the center, tucked away with distant relatives. Daniel, of course, was seated at my father's side, his rightful throne in this family drama. Margaret, though, had been given a place of honor as well, her quiet presence commanding more respect than my parents likely realized. I took my seat and tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. The chatter around me was lively, but I could barely taste the food. My gaze kept drifting toward the head of the table, where my father and Daniel exchanged words with the ease of two men speaking the same language. My mother laughed at Daniel's jokes, leaning in close, her hand resting briefly on his arm as if to say, "You are everything we hoped for." And then, just as dessert was being cleared, my father lifted his glass and tapped it with a silver spoon. The sound cut through the room like a signal. Conversations died down, all eyes turning toward him. He rose slowly, his expression solemn but proud, his posture commanding. 60 years, he began, his voice carrying easily, practiced from decades of boardrooms and public addresses. They say the first 60 are just the beginning. But a man cannot help but think about legacy, about what remains when he is gone. The word again. Legacy. My chest tightened. I looked at Daniel, who was sitting taller now, his jaw set, his eyes steady on our father. He knew what was coming, too. My father gestured toward the photographs on the walls, buildings he had built, skyscrapers that bore his company's name, developments that had shaped entire skylines. These are part of my legacy. But buildings, no matter how strong, are just structures. The true legacy is people, the next generation. He paused, his gaze settling on Daniel, and in that silence, I heard everything. I knew before he said it aloud that this was not my night, not my story. And yet, I couldn't look away. I sat frozen, wine glass trembling in my hand, as my father prepared to make the announcement that would define the rest of the evening and expose, in the most public way possible, exactly where I stood in this family. The clinking of silver against crystal silenced the room. I had been bracing myself ever since. Whispers of a big announcement began to ripple through the hallways, but nothing could have prepared me for the weight of my father's words. He stood tall at the head of the table, his glass raised, the chandeliers casting sharp angles across his face, making him look more like a judge than a man celebrating a birthday. 60 years, he began, his voice commanding, trained by decades of boardroom speeches and public accolades. A man reaches this point and naturally reflects on legacy. Not just the legacy of buildings or wealth, but the legacy of people, those who will carry forward the vision. His eyes swept the table, pausing deliberately on Daniel, who straightened almost imperceptibly in his seat. I could feel my chest tighten, my breath shallow. This was it. When Daniel joined Carter Developments, my father continued, I wondered if he had what it would take. I did not want to hand him anything he had not earned. He smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen all night, and laid a hand on Daniel's shoulder. But he proved himself. Again and again, he has expanded our portfolio, built relationships I never could have dreamed of, and secured projects that will define the future of this company. Tonight, it is my honor to announce that we are transferring majority ownership of Carter Developments to him, along with $3 million in a trust to fund expansion into new markets. Applause erupted around the table. Guests rose slightly in their chairs, clapping, some even calling Daniel's name like it was a coronation. My brother stood, modestly bowing his head, the picture of humility, though I caught the flicker of triumph in his eyes. Beside him, Sophia smiled proudly, but even she glanced in my direction with something softer, almost apologetic. I sat frozen, my coffee cup halfway to my lips, heat rising in my cheeks. It wasn't the announcement itself that gutted me. I had always known Daniel would inherit everything. It was the theater of it, the way my father used the occasion to exalt my brother before an audience that included half the city's elite. It was a public crowning, and I was nothing more than an afterthought, seated at the far end of the table like a distant cousin instead of his daughter. But my father wasn't finished. He raised his hand, quieting the applause, his gaze sweeping the room again before landing squarely on me. I felt the air shift, an uneasy stillness settling over the table. Some of you may be wondering about our daughter Natalie, he said, and my stomach turned to stone. She has chosen a different path. Against our advice, she pursued art. He said the word like it was a disease. While we supported her education, we believe it is time to let her stand on her own. She is 32 years old. It is time for the safety net to come off. The words hit me like blows, but he didn't stop there. His voice sharpened, his tone no longer celebratory but surgical. Let us be honest. After more than a decade, what does she have to show for it? A few paintings sold here and there, teaching children for minimum wage, dreams that have no foundation in the real world? I love my daughter, but this so-called career has failed. She must grow up. Gasps rippled across the table. Even those who had never given me more than polite nods seemed shocked by the brutality of his words. My hands trembled under the table, nails digging into the wood as I fought the rising wave of tears. My vision blurred, the chandelier above splintering into shards of light through my wet eyes. I had braced myself for dismissal, for indifference, but not this. Not public humiliation, not a deliberate stripping away of my dignity in front of strangers. My mother nodded beside him, her expression a perfect mask of concern, but her silence was complicity. We've always encouraged self-reliance, she added smoothly, as if her words were a balm rather than another twist of the knife. I tried to swallow, tried to force down the lump in my throat, but the weight of their judgment pressed heavier than ever before. In that moment, I wasn't 32 years old. I wasn't a woman who had fought for her place in the world. I was a child again, invisible, diminished, desperate for a sliver of approval. I glanced around the table, searching for any sign of rescue. Sophia stared down at her plate, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn, but he said nothing. A few cousins exchanged awkward glances. My grandmother, however, remained still, her eyes fixed on my father with a calm intensity that almost unsettled me more than his words. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. My father lifted his glass once more. To Daniel, and to the future of Carter developments. Glasses rose hesitantly, the applause more subdued this time, but still, the moment was sealed. I sat rigid in my chair, my own glass untouched, my dignity hanging by a thread. Memories flashed in my mind, unbidden but sharp as knives. The time my parents missed my middle school play to attend one of Daniel's tournaments, the art show where I stood alone while other kids' families took photos with them in front of their work. The hollow congratulations my father offered at my RISD graduation before pivoting to brag about Daniel's first job. Each memory piled atop the other until I could barely breathe. And yet, even as I sat there, humiliated, a strange calm began to settle over me. I realized that if I broke now, if I let the tears fall, my father would see it as proof that he was right, that I was fragile, unserious, weak. So I forced myself to sit taller, to keep my chin lifted, even as my insides crumbled. It was in that unbearable silence, when the weight of my father's judgment threatened to crush me entirely, that a movement at the head of the table drew every eye. Slowly, deliberately, my grandmother Margaret rose to her feet. At 80 years old, she still carried herself with regal strength, her posture straighter than any of us, her presence impossible to ignore. She smoothed the front of her dress, her gaze sweeping the table before settling on my father. "Edward," she said, her voice clear, steady, and somehow sharper than his. That was quite the announcement, very dramatic. She paused, letting the tension stretch until the room was taut with expectation. Then she added, "But I think now it's my turn." And in that moment, the humiliation began to crack, making space for something else entirely, something I could not yet name, but that I sensed would change everything. When my grandmother pushed her chair back and rose to her feet, the entire dining room fell into a silence so absolute it felt as if even the flickering candles had paused. She was 80 years old, yet in that moment, she looked taller than anyone in the room. Her silver hair framed her face like a crown, her blue dress catching the chandelier light, and her posture was regal, unyielding. She didn't tremble, didn't fidget, didn't hesitate. All she did was place one steady hand on the table, let her eyes sweep the room, and command attention without raising her voice. "Edward," she said evenly, Her gaze locked on my father. That was quite the announcement. Very dramatic. Nervous chuckles rippled through the room, but no one dared laugh outright. My father shifted in his chair, his face tight. "Mother," he began, his tone clipped, "perhaps we can discuss family matters at another time." She lifted a hand to silence him, and the gesture alone was enough to stop him cold. "No," she said firmly. "Now is precisely the right time, especially since we have so many witnesses." I watched, bewildered, as she reached into her handbag and drew out a leather-bound portfolio. The sight of it sent a murmur through the guests. What secrets could an elderly woman possibly be carrying in that unassuming case? My father's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing, but Margaret ignored him completely. "Most of you know me as Edward's mother, Victoria's mother-in-law, a woman who has spent the last 60 years moving quietly in the background of this family. You know me as a hostess, a grandmother, a widow. What you don't know," she paused, letting the tension stretch until the silence hummed, "is who I was before all of this." She opened the portfolio and spread several documents across the table. The closest guests leaned forward, their eyes darting across the papers, their faces shifting from confusion to astonishment. "Before I married Harold Carter," she continued, "I was Margaret Louise Madison, and under that name, I built something of my own. In the early years, I owned a gallery in New York. I was told to sell it when I married, because it was inappropriate for the wife of a banker to work. But I never gave it up. Instead, I rebuilt it quietly, discreetly, under a different name. That gallery grew into an international art investment firm you all know today as MLM Fine Arts." The collective gasp around the table was like a physical wave. People turned to one another, whispering in disbelief. My own heart lurched. MLM Fine Arts. I knew the name. Everyone in the art world did. It was one of the most powerful firms in the country, shaping collections, steering markets, defining reputations. My grandmother, my quiet, elegant grandmother, was behind it all? My father's face had drained of color. "That's impossible," he said flatly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Margaret gave a small, satisfied smile. "It's not only possible, Edward. It's true. For 50 years, while you built your skyscrapers and your empire, I built one of my own. You never asked, and I never told you, because you would not have understood." She let that sink in before turning her eyes to me. Suddenly, the full weight of her revelation shifted, landing squarely on my shoulders. "Natalie," she said softly, her voice changing from sharp authority to something warm and protective, "I have been watching you all your life. I saw in you the same fire I once had. And while your parents dismissed your art as a distraction, I knew it was something else entirely. I knew it was real. I could feel every eye in the room on me. My hand shook, but I couldn't look away from her. For years, I've been acquiring your work quietly, through intermediaries, so you wouldn't know it was me. Those pieces now hang in private collections across Europe and America. 3 of them are in homes you would recognize from magazine covers. And one," she paused, her eyes gleaming, "was recently acquired by the Whitney Museum for their permanent collection." The room erupted again, this time with whispers and gasps. I stared at her, unable to process what she was saying. "The Whitney. My work was in the Whitney?" Margaret signaled to a server, who handed me a tablet. On the screen was a portfolio of my paintings, catalogued with the names of collectors, museums, and institutions. My pieces hung in pristine living rooms, behind velvet ropes, in galleries I had only ever dreamed of. My chest tightened as the truth sank in. She hadn't just believed in me, she had changed the very trajectory of my career without me knowing. "And now," she continued, her voice rising slightly as though delivering a verdict, "I am ready to bring this all into the open. I have purchased a gallery space in Chelsea. Renovations begin next week. It will be called the Natalie Carter Gallery. You will have a platform for your work, as well as the work of other emerging artists I've been following. And to ensure its success, I am investing $2 million in its launch and operations." I nearly dropped the tablet. $2 million. My heart pounded so hard I thought the entire table could hear it. The room was in chaos. Guests stared at me with newfound fascination, some rushing to congratulate me, others whispering about the shocking revelation. My mother sat stiff, her hand clamped around her wine glass, her knuckles white. My father looked as if someone had just pulled the ground out from beneath him. Margaret, however, was unshaken. She moved around the table, her hand brushing my shoulder as she stopped behind me. "This young woman, whom you have all dismissed, is not a failure. She is an artist of vision, courage, and authenticity. The only failure here is the blindness of those who could not see it." Her words rang out like a verdict, and for the first time in my life, I felt the room tilt in my direction. People who had ignored me moments earlier now looked at me with interest, respect, even awe. But beneath the noise and the shock, I felt something else, an almost unbearable mix of gratitude, confusion, and fear. Gratitude for my grandmother's unwavering belief, confusion over the revelation that my work had been validated in ways I hadn't even known, and fear, because I knew this would not end tonight. My father would not let this pass quietly. Margaret squeezed my shoulder gently, leaning down so only I could hear. "This is your moment, Natalie. Don't let them take it from you." And just as quickly as she had risen, she returned to her chair, leaving the room buzzing with questions, my father seething, and me reeling from a truth that had upended everything I thought I knew about my place in the Carter family. I didn't yet realize that this was only the beginning, that the battle lines had just been drawn, and the fallout from her revelation would change us all. The party after my grandmother's revelation felt like standing inside a building whose foundation had just cracked, the walls still upright, the chandeliers still glittering, the laughter still echoing, but beneath it all, everything unstable, waiting to collapse. Guests drifted toward me with a curiosity that bordered on hunger. Minutes earlier, I had been invisible, the subject of polite pity or subtle scorn. Now people I barely knew leaned close to shake my hand, praising the courage it must have taken to pursue my art, as if they had admired me all along. Their sudden warmth felt false, like spotlights turned on only because my grandmother had given permission. My father sat rigid at the head of the table, his jaw tight, his face flushed. My mother tried to smile, though the expression looked brittle, as though it might shatter at any second. Daniel kept his eyes on his plate, pushing food around with his fork, his shoulders stiff. I had never seen him so uncertain. Sophia, on the other hand, looked at me with open sympathy, her gaze flicking between me and Margaret as if silently cheering us on. When the cake came out and the guests began to sing "Happy Birthday," the entire performance felt surreal. My father forced a smile, blowing out the candles with more scotch than air in his lungs, and for the first time in my life, I realized how fragile his power really was. He had always seemed unshakable, untouchable. But tonight my grandmother had stolen the spotlight, and there was nothing he could do to wrest it back. Later, as guests began to trickle out, I felt a hand on my arm. "Daniel." He motioned toward the study, his usual confidence replaced by something subdued. I followed him, my heart pounding, uncertain of what he wanted. The study smelled of leather and old cigars, the walls lined with books I doubted my father had ever read. Daniel leaned against the massive desk, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "That was unexpected," he said finally. I crossed my arms, waiting. "To say the least." He let out a slow breath. "I had no idea Grandma was behind MLM. No idea she was buying your work. Honestly, I don't think anyone did. Not even Dad." I studied him, searching for mockery, but there was none. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual bravado. "I thought maybe you were in on it," he admitted. "That you'd planned this with her." I shook my head. "I was as shocked as you were." He looked down, his jaw tight. "Dad's furious, not just about the gallery, but about the money. He hates that she had an entire empire he didn't know about. It undermines him." "Is that what matters to him?" I asked, my voice sharp. "That he didn't know? Not that he humiliated his daughter in front of everyone?" Daniel's eyes flicked up, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of guilt. That was harsh. Even for him. I didn't know he was going to say all that. Would you have stopped him if you had? I asked. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us. Finally, he said, I don't know. Maybe. I never understood your choices, Natalie. I thought you were being stubborn, wasting your potential. But tonight, he shook his head, almost in disbelief. Tonight made me realize I might not know as much as I thought. The words unsettled me. For years, Daniel had been the benchmark against which I was measured, the flawless standard I could never reach. To hear him admit he might have been wrong chipped away at something hardened inside me. Before I could respond, the door opened. My father stood there, composed but with eyes that burned. You two, come with me. His voice left no room for refusal. He led us to a smaller sitting room, where my mother perched on the edge of a brocade chair, her hands clenched in her lap. Margaret was already there, relaxed, as if she had been waiting for this confrontation. I invited your grandmother to join us, my father said stiffly, though the way he spoke made it sound like an insult. Since she's taken such an interest in family matters tonight. Someone had to, Margaret replied smoothly. My mother's voice was tight. Natalie, this gallery plan, do you really think it's wise to let her push you into this? It's sudden, extravagant. It doesn't make sense. Ever. Sudden for you, perhaps, Margaret said, her tone sharp. I've been planning it for years. My father's eyes narrowed. Do you understand how this looks, Natalie? After all the concerns we've had about your choices, suddenly your grandmother reveals this elaborate scheme. People will think we've been blind. Because you were, I said, my voice louder than I intended. Their eyes snapped to me. For the first time, I didn't shrink under their gaze. You never once believed in me. You never once saw me. You only saw what I wasn't, compared to Daniel. What I wasn't compared to your definition of success. You wanted me to fit into your narrow mold, and when I didn't, you dismissed me. My mother's lips trembled. We only wanted what was best for you, security, stability. No, I said firmly. You wanted what was easiest to understand. You never tried to see me. You never tried to value what mattered to me. The words hung heavy in the air. My father's jaw worked as though he wanted to speak, but no sound came. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, looking between us. Margaret sat silently, her eyes soft but steady, letting me claim my voice without interruption. Finally, my father said, his tone clipped, perhaps we've been too focused on certain measures of success. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I had ever heard from him. I stood abruptly, my pulse still racing. I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need your money, your validation, your conditions. I have a gallery to prepare for, and whether you choose to be part of that or not is up to you. But I'm done waiting. The room went silent. My mother stared at me, stricken. My father's face was unreadable. Daniel's brow furrowed, as if re-evaluating everything he thought he knew. Margaret gave me the faintest nod, a silent confirmation that I had taken the step she had always hoped I would. I walked out of that room feeling like I had crossed an invisible threshold, one I could never retreat from. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just reacting to their judgment, I was defining myself without it. But as I stepped back into the great hall, where the last guests were shrugging into coats and murmuring about the evening's drama, I knew the story wasn't over. My father had lost control of the narrative tonight, and men like him didn't surrender easily. What I didn't know then was that the battle over power, legacy, and love within our family had only just begun. The weeks after my father's birthday party passed in a blur of noise and silence, both inside me and around me. On the surface, life in Brooklyn looked the same cracked sidewalks, the same squealing pipes in my studio, the same quiet hours with a paintbrush in my hand. But beneath that, everything had shifted. My grandmother's revelation had cracked open a door I hadn't even known existed, and now I was standing at the threshold of a world I wasn't sure I was ready to step into. The first time Margaret took me to the Chelsea space she had purchased, I couldn't breathe. It was a former factory, with ceilings so high the air seemed to echo, and wide brick walls scarred by time. Dust clung to the corners, and the floor was uneven in places, But the light, oh, the light. Wide industrial windows poured sunlight across the space, the kind of light that made colors come alive. I walked through slowly, my fingers trailing across the rough surface of the walls, my heart pounding with both awe and terror. "This will be your world," Margaret said, her heels clicking against the concrete as she followed me. "Not just for your work, but for the voices you believe in. This is where you will build something lasting." I swallowed hard, trying to imagine it. Me, a gallery owner. Not just a painter scraping by, but someone who could shape the narrative of art itself. The thought was intoxicating and suffocating. Renovations began almost immediately. Architects, contractors, lighting experts, all of them came through, tossing around numbers and sketches. Margaret seemed to glide through it all effortlessly, negotiating terms, questioning details, reminding everyone that she had not built an empire by being ignored. I trailed beside her, overwhelmed but learning, absorbing every sharp question she asked, every precise demand she made. At night, I would sit cross-legged on the floor of my studio, surrounded by sketches and unfinished canvases, trying to make sense of the tidal wave that had swept into my life. Was this really happening? Did I deserve it? Or was I just another Carter, benefiting from family wealth, even if it came from the grandmother who had kept it hidden? Margaret seemed to sense my turmoil. One evening, after we'd spent hours reviewing potential exhibition layouts, she poured us each a glass of wine in her apartment overlooking Central Park. "You keep asking yourself if you've earned this," she said quietly. "Let me answer for you. Yes. I bought your work because it was good, because it deserved to be seen. The gallery is not a gift, it's an investment. The rest is up to you." Her words steadied me, but they also frightened me. Because if I failed, it wouldn't just be my dream collapsing, it would be her faith in me too. Amid the chaos of planning, I found an unexpected ally in Sophia. She began dropping by my studio on her way home from the hospital, still in scrubs, carrying coffee, and asking about my work. She wasn't like the rest of the family. She didn't pretend to understand art in technical terms, but she listened. She asked why I used certain colors, why a figure was blurred instead of sharp, why a canvas felt heavier than another. Her curiosity made me explain my process in ways I never had before, and in doing so, I began to see my own work more clearly. "Daniel admires you more than he lets on," she confessed one night as she leaned against the windowsill, sipping her coffee. I laughed bitterly. "Daniel? The Golden Heir? I doubt that." "I'm serious," she insisted. "He's not as invincible as he looks. He carries the weight of your father's expectations like a chain. Every success is expected. Every mistake is a failure. You think you're the only one who feels trapped, Natalie, but you're not." Her words stayed with me long after she left, complicating the image I had carried of my brother all these years. Could it be possible that we were both prisoners of the same legacy, just in different cells? As opening night drew closer, the pressure mounted. Margaret insisted on a guest list filled with collectors, critics, and artists with influence. "You need the right eyes on your work," she said. "Visibility is everything." I poured myself into my canvases, painting until my hands cramped, scraping back layers and rebuilding them, chasing a vision that always seemed just out of reach. My studio became a battlefield, littered with discarded sketches and the smell of turpentine. But slowly, pieces emerged that felt true. There were nights when fear threatened to suffocate me. What if the critics hated my work? What if the gallery failed? What if this was all too big for me? I confessed as much to Margaret once, my voice shaking. She looked at me with a calm I couldn't fathom. "Fear means you care. Use it. Let it sharpen you, not break you." Still, the closer we came, the more restless I became. I stopped sleeping. My mind replayed my father's words at the dinner table, calling me a failure, dismissing my art as meaningless. I painted late into the night, as if every brushstroke was a way of proving him wrong. But beneath that defiance was a quieter truth. I wasn't painting for him anymore. I was painting for me. For the girl who had sketched in the margins of her notebooks, who had been told she was less, who had kept creating even when no one cared. The night before the gallery's opening, I walked alone through the finished space. The walls gleamed, the lighting was perfect, and my paintings hung in silence, waiting. It felt both terrifying and holy, like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing you had to jump. I ran my fingers lightly over the title plaque beneath one of my canvases, my name, etched cleanly, no longer something to be hidden or dismissed. I closed my eyes and let myself imagine what tomorrow might bring. The crowd, the voices, the judgments, the possibility of failure, the possibility of everything. And though I didn't yet know it, tomorrow would bring not just the validation I had long craved, but also confrontations that would test the fragile fault lines of my family in ways none of us were prepared for. The night of the gallery opening felt like stepping into a dream I wasn't entirely convinced belonged to me. From the outside, the building still bore the bones of its industrial past, but inside, it had been transformed. Spotlights angled perfectly against fresh white walls. The air hummed with low music and the murmur of voices. My paintings hung larger than life, no longer trapped in the confines of my studio, but given room to breathe, to speak. I stood near the entrance in a simple black dress, my palms damp, my pulse hammering so loud I thought others might hear it. The gallery filled quickly, collectors, critics, fellow artists, faces I recognized from magazines and others I didn't. Their eyes scanned the room, their voices carried an easy confidence, as though they belonged here. I felt like an intruder in my own world. Margaret appeared beside me, radiant in a deep red gown, her cane clicking lightly against the polished floor. She slipped her arm through mine. "Nervous?" she asked, her eyes glittering. "Terrified," I whispered. "Good, it means you care." The doors opened again, and the crowd swelled. Sophia was one of the first to reach me, her embrace firm, her smile wide. "You did this," she said softly, her voice fierce. "Don't forget that." Behind her came Daniel, awkward in a way I had never seen before, offering a handshake when a hug would have felt more natural. His eyes flicked over the space, the crowd, my paintings, and though he said little, I caught something in his expression. I never thought I'd see respect. Then my parents arrived. The room seemed to notice before I did, heads turning as Edward and Victoria Carter stepped inside. My father wore his authority like armor, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. My mother looked impeccable, but her eyes darted around the gallery, as though searching for a flaw. When they reached me, she spoke first. "This is remarkable, Natalie," she said, her voice stiff, almost brittle. "Very impressive." My father nodded, his gaze moving across the paintings before settling back on me. "Quite a turnout," he remarked, as though that were the only measure of success. "Thank you for coming," I managed, and despite everything, I meant it. Their presence mattered more than I wanted to admit. The night unfolded in a blur of conversations. Critics lingered in front of my canvases, scribbling notes. Collectors asked questions about my techniques, my influences, the stories behind the pieces. A curator from a major museum shook my hand, promising to keep in touch. With each exchange, I felt myself slowly shifting, grounding. These people weren't humoring me. They were engaging with me as an artist. And then came the red dots. At first, just one, then another, then several more, marking the paintings that had been sold. I tried to hide my shock, but inside, my heart leapt with each one. By the end of the night, more than half my work was spoken for. For the first time in my life, my art wasn't just seen, it was valued. Yet beneath the celebration, tension coiled. I caught my father watching me more than once, his expression impossible to read. My mother avoided lingering near Margaret, keeping her distance as though proximity might ignite another revelation. Daniel drifted through the room quietly, but his silence felt weighted, his gaze lingering on canvases longer than necessary. At one point, Sophia pulled me aside. "Your father's proud, even if he'll never admit it," she whispered. "Don't let his silence fool you." I smiled faintly, but inside, I wasn't sure. Pride wasn't a word I could easily associate with him, not toward me. But the possibility flickered like a fragile flame. Later in the evening, Margaret called for a toast. She stood near the center of the gallery, her glass raised, her voice steady. "To Natalie," she said, "and to all artists who dare to tell the truth even when the world refuses to listen. Tonight we celebrate not just an opening, but a beginning." The crowd cheered, glasses clinked, and for a moment, I felt suspended in light, seen in a way I had never been before. But as the applause died down and the conversations resumed, I noticed my father slipping away from the crowd. He moved toward the far end of the gallery, where one of my largest pieces hung, a mixed media canvas layered with fragments of unsent letters I had written to him over the years. I froze as he stopped in front of it, his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted slightly. I wanted to go to him, to explain, to tell him those words were my attempt to bridge the chasm between us. But something held me back. Instead, I watched from across the room as he stood there longer than I expected, his face unreadable, his body still. When he finally turned, his eyes found mine. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something crack in his armor, something raw, unguarded. But then it was gone, replaced by his usual mask. The night ended with praise, congratulations, and promises of future collaborations. Yet as the last guests trickled out and the gallery grew quiet, I couldn't shake the sense that something unresolved lingered in the air. My grandmother had given me a platform. My art had spoken louder than I ever dared hope. But the fractures in my family were still deep, still jagged. And as I sat alone in the gallery, staring at the piece my father had lingered before, I knew this night was not an ending. It was a turning point, one that would demand more of me than I had ever given before. Looking back now, I realized that night, at my father's birthday, wasn't the breaking point I once thought it was. It was the beginning. Being humiliated in front of an entire room of people forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding for years. I had spent my whole life chasing validation from people who were never willing to give it. And in that moment of pain, my grandmother opened a door I didn't even know existed, a door that led me toward my own freedom. The gallery became more than just a space for my paintings. It became a space for healing, for redefining what success meant. Not just for me, but for everyone who stepped through its doors. Each exhibition was proof that there was power in following your own path, even when the people closest to you don't understand. Every conversation I had with young artists reminded me of who I once was, the girl sketching in the margins, desperate to be seen, and how far I had come since then. My relationship with my family didn't transform overnight. Healing rarely works that way. It came slowly, in cautious words and small gestures. My mother began asking questions instead of offering judgment. My father, though never one for apologies, started showing up, not perfectly, not always gracefully, but enough that I began to see his humanity beneath the armor he had worn for so long. Even Daniel and I found common ground, realizing we had both been trapped by the same expectations, only in different cages. But perhaps the greatest transformation was the one within me. For the first time, I stopped defining myself in opposition to others. I no longer needed to prove I wasn't a failure, because I finally understood that worth doesn't come from applause, money, or even family approval. Worth comes from living in alignment with who you are, from honoring the fire inside you, even when others try to put it out. If there's one lesson I want to leave you with, it's this. The people who doubt you, dismiss you, or even humiliate you may actually be setting the stage for your greatest transformation. Sometimes, what feels like the end is really the moment you begin. So if you're holding back on something because you're afraid of what others will think, don't. Create. Begin. Step into the life that feels true to you, even if no one else understands it yet. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by people you love, only to discover your own strength because of it?